So as you can see behind me, it's winter here in the southern part of Canada, here in December. So if you happen to stumble across this video in, say, the summertime, sorry about the reminder. And you're probably wondering, why am I doing my intro outdoors? I have no idea. So you're probably watching this video because you are a subscriber to the Adobe Photography Suite, otherwise known as the Adobe Tax. And you're probably a little resentful of the fact that you have to pay for Photoshop as well as Lightroom. Now, Lightroom is a great way of doing initial adjustments to your images, like vibrance, clarity, exposure, and so on. But if you want to take your post-processing to the next level, you really need Photoshop. So that's why we're doing this today. I'm going to show you how to do some basic navigation around Photoshop. It is probably a bit of an intimidating package, but the key here is to just concentrate on the tools that you need. So hopefully we'll do that. And I hope to make a series out of this where we'll follow up with some more detailed instructions as to how to do post-processing in Photoshop. But for now, we're going to do navigation, and I'm going to go inside and show you how it's done. Okay, so assuming you've opened Photoshop, and you may have opened a photo already, as you see here. I can make this larger by hitting Control plus in Windows, or Control minus. I can make it smaller. You might also see a bunch of boxes over here, or windows. And as you can see, my desktop right now is clear. So let's go through the menu system slowly. And I'll teach it in the same way I teach students one-on-one. So we'll take it kind of slow here. So a lot of instructional YouTube videos tend to go a little fast. So we'll take it a bit slower. So if you click on Window, we're going to start on the right-hand side here. And this is how we're going to set up some of these boxes or windows that you saw over here. So if you see, let's click on Adjustments. And I don't know if you're following along, you may want to do the same thing. You notice this box pops up with adjustments in it, but let's do the rest here. Adjustments. I'm also going to ask you to open History. And then Window again, and Histogram. Window again, and then there's Layers, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video. That's a subject in and of itself. And then down here, Options and Tools are open. You'll see as I click or unclick Options, that little bar at the top disappeared. We'll bring it back again, and you can see where it is. It's this bar up here, which gives you basically some fine adjustments for tools that you might pick from here. This is the toolbar on the left, and there we go. It's gone, so we can bring it back again. So if any of those things disappear, just go up to the window and window pull down, I should say, or drop down, and reselect them. So now you can see we've got some of these things selected. I could have picked more, but I don't want to clutter up my desktop. What we're going to try to do in these videos is keep things as simple as possible. Photoshop is, as I say to my students, is a bit of a monster. There's all kinds of stuff in there that you probably won't ever use. So let's limit it to the tools that you think you'll need. So just to show you how you can play around with these boxes to either reduce the amount of clutter that they create or expand them out again. So that you notice up here there's a kind of a double arrow. That's kind of a minimize control, if you like. And then you can expand it again. So you can do that with any one of these boxes. So if you're not using, let's say, the Layers panel very much, you could just temporarily, you can leave it there, but you can make it much smaller, and then you can move it around, just shove it off to the side or whatever. So if there's another trick we can use to maximize our workspace. And if I grab the top bar of one of these windows And if I bring it over here, you notice it kind of goes transparent. That means it's now going to create a tab in the same box as this one. So now you can click back and forth between these ones. And similarly, I can add another one to the party here. Wait till it goes transparent, let go of your left button on the mouse, and now you've created this one big panel, and you can minimize it. And you notice it gives you symbols for each of those different functions. So let's add this guy to it as well. I think that will work. Not quite. Let's expand this one first. And now we'll grab this one. It's attached itself. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So if we deattach it just by grabbing it somewhere in the middle, I can now go up until it turns transparent. And now we've minimized this panel to be just a bunch of tabs. And that may or may not work for you. You may want to always have something open like this history panel, for instance. And again, I'll explain what all these do a little later, so don't feel that you have to know what they're for at this point. So yeah, I can just drag them off again. Just grab that tab and pull it off, and now we've got all these separate windows open. So, but having clutter like that doesn't always make for efficient work flow. So we may want to just minimize some of these for now. Okay, so let's talk about what each of these things mean. There's a specific reason I picked these 5 boxes, because each one of them I think are the kind of minimum that you'll need if you're going to do anything in Photoshop. And just to kind of step back a second, the difference between Photoshop and Lightroom. Lightroom does not do layers. And that's the main reason why Adobe has bundled Photoshop and Lightroom together. For most adjustments, all you need is Lightroom, just to do some, exposure adjustments, black level, white level adjustments, and that kind of thing. But when you have to do something a bit more fancy, like compositing, which is building up one image out of several other images, then you'll need Photoshop. And that's kind of why we're here, and that's again why they bundled them together. And you've probably been intimidated by Photoshop up until now, but it really does a lot of what Lightroom does, minus the organization into a catalog. That's where Lightroom really shines. But again, Lightroom does not do layers. So let's talk about what's in these boxes. And you'll notice here, as I highlight under the adjustments panel, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure, vibrance. These are adjustments that you might do in Lightroom if you're going to just stick with Lightroom, but you can do the same thing here. If I go over to here to the image drop down for a moment, you'll notice there's also something called adjustments, and guess what? It's got the same things as that adjustments panel has, which is brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure, vibrance, and so on. The difference is that adjustments, what this will do is put another layer on top of your image, and that's called non-destructive editing. So in other words, if I wanted to change the brightness of this picture that we have up now, I could click on this brightness contrast panel, and now it's giving me this panel that I can do this sort of thing. I can brighten the whole picture or darken the whole picture. And if I just move this out of the way for a moment, and all this too, I'm going to minimize that. You can see that, in our layers panel up here, it's actually created another layer. And this is what layers look like. And you can turn layers on or off. So if, for instance, now that I'm highlighted on this layer, if I continue doing this brightening thing here, I can turn that off and see my original, which is what it's always called background layer by default in Photoshop. So switch it on, switch it off. So you can see it's non-destructive because I can just for instance, right click on this layer and just say delete layer. And I'm back to my original picture here. If I went over to image, and I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, and I went brightness contrast, and I started making brightness changes to this image, you'll notice there's no layer that I can delete if I don't like what I've done. If I say OK and I save this file, I've now baked in that change, and there's no going around it. But in this case, I'm just going to cancel out. So there are other adjustments here, such as levels, which I'll explain later, and curves, which I'll explain later. But you'll notice if I click on any one of them, let's say vibrance, that's most Lightroom users are probably familiar with that one, comes up with a panel where I can adjust vibrance or saturation on the image. But again, it's created a separate layer here, which I can either keep or I can temporarily shut off and save my file out without it, or I can switch it on and save the file with that on there. And of course, I can save the file. Now I'll have to save it as a layered file, which is either a PSD file, which is the native layered file format for Photoshop, or I could save it as a TIFF, but I can't save it as a JPEG anymore because JPEGs don't support layers. So that's what the adjustments panel does. And I'm going to point you down to this history panel now. And what you can see here is it literally shows you a history of steps we've taken. Here we've opened the file. And down here, we played with that brightness contrast layer, which we got from up here, right up here on the adjustments panel. And then we deleted the layer, and now we've added a new vibrance layer. I can, if I actually click back, let's say to this point, that vibrance layer now disappears, and we're back to the step where we had the brightness contrast layer. So let's say I wanted to add, let's just say a curves layer now. You notice what it's done. It's wiped out those steps that follow the one that we were on when we opened this new layer. So now it's just the curves layer, the vibrance layer has disappeared, and we've got the brightness contrast layer. So I might be getting a little ahead of myself here with layers, but that's just to show you the difference between non-destructive editing using the adjustments panel, which creates layers above your background or original, versus going over here to image and using adjustments, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, etc., directly on the background layer, which is considered destructive. So just looking at this history panel once again, or window, whatever you want to call it, clicking back to any stage in this history, you can see what was actually done to your image. And if you wanted to delete everything, let's say from this step onward, you just right click on it, say delete, and it'll ask you if you want to actually delete it, and you say yes. And so now anything you do from here on in will just be added to this list. So it's a great way to go back and make changes before you save out your file. Now, as far as I know, I've never been able to recall the history once I've saved the file. You're kind of starting from scratch, opening up whatever modifications you've done to your file. If you make those modifications, save it out, open it up again, you're starting at this point, which just says open, and making any subsequent changes from there. But you won't be able to go back, to my knowledge, and undo some of those things you did before you saved the file out. But the great thing is, if you save it as a layered file like a TIFF or a PSD, you can always go back in and delete any of these layers and start again. So that's one of the differences between Photoshop and Lightroom, is that this history panel is only good, I believe, while you are doing the edit. Once you save it out and close the file, you can't get that history back. Lightroom, you always have that history available, and That's probably because it's a virtual image. You're not actually working on the image. You're just pulling up an instance of it in Lightroom and doing virtual actions to it. You're actually just saving your actions to a database. You're not actually modifying the original file, whereas here you are. Okay, so just you notice I've got two tabs up here. I've got a separate image, which this is a composite that I did, just kind of a fun thing, showing a giant grabbing an airplane out of the air. And the series is called Damn Giants, and I did a number of images like this where giants come to the earth and start playing around. Anyway, that's not the important thing. But the important thing here is just to show you what layers look like on a composite image. That is one where we've dragged in, let's say in this case, this airplane. If I can switch that layer on and off, and you can see, more or less what we started with. Actually, if I shut all these layers off, you'll eventually see the hand disappear. That's the picture I started with. And then I added the hand in and did some covering up of the hand and blending in, and then added the airplane to it later. So that's what layers are all about. And until we get into a subsequent video, I am going to leave layers at this point. So at this point, you're probably wondering, well, how did he get those two tabs up there? All I simply did was just open these two files, and you'll see that it creates a tab for each of them. This one I can click on, or this one I can click on. And if I click on this one, I can drag that. It's actually got its own window, and you'll see behind it is the one we were looking at with the airplane. So similar to the way we move boxes around these adjustment panels, as you see on the right, we can also move this up until it goes transparent, and boom, it creates a tab there. So you can have multiple images open at the same time, and you can click between them or move them around on your workspace. So you can see how quickly we can get a very cluttered looking screen. And again, if we want to make this image larger, get as much workspace as possible, we can still do that. But now let's go back here and right click on the second step after opening up the file and close that off. And so we can now get rid of some of these other boxes. I don't know why, but some of these, like libraries, comes up regardless of whether or not you've selected it. So you might want to do something like this. Just rearrange these boxes, overlap them if you wish, or you can make them stick together so that there's two tabs on one panel. There, that looks a little better. So next thing to talk about is the histogram. Now the histogram is really no different than the histogram you'll see on the LCD panel on the back of your digital SLR or digital mirrorless camera, depending on which you're using. Just wanted to show you there's some options here for the histogram. Right now I'm showing what's called RGB. It just combines the three red, green, and blue channels to show you a kind of a buildup of the distribution. You can see I'm actually crushing some black black portions of the image here, but that's all part of the artistic effect on this particular image. So forgive me for that. If we go over to colors, you actually see the three channels. You can see it's the blue channel that's actually clipping here. So this isn't really any different from what you see in the back of your camera. There is a little pancake stack here that will allow you to change things. You can just do a compact view, which just shows you what you've last selected, which in this case is just the colors RGB, the colors, separate colors, I should say. Or you can go expanded view and you can change it back to either luminosity, which shows the black, just the black and white equivalent, levels in your image, or you can go RGB, which just combines all three channels and shows you a kind of a black and white version of the histogram. But down here on the expanded version, you get some statistics, which I often find useful because you might want to get sort of the average value of your image falling at 128, which is middle gray. But that's a refinement. You don't have to worry about that. Most people probably ignore these numbers anyway, but it gives you an idea of how the histogram is distributed. Okay, just to round out this first video on navigation around the Photoshop workspace, let's just quickly go over to the image dropdown. And here you'll notice a thing called mode. Right now we're in RGB color, and that's where I'd recommend you stay and keep it at 8 bits per channel, otherwise you're going to have some very large files. Things like CMYK, that's just for if you're working, say, with a printer, you probably want to output in that color space. There's another one called grayscale. I'll just show you quickly and ask you if you want to discard the color information. And you can just say discard, and you get something like that. But it's just, there's no control over that one. So if I go back over to my history panel here, I'm going to right click and delete that. Yes. And I'll show you under the image pull down, we were in mode. Let's go into adjustments. There's another way of doing black and white. And again, this is a bit of a refinement, but you can go to this panel, which allows you to essentially simulate what color filters will do to an image. So you can see some things changing as I pull these sliders back and forth. So that's another way of creating a black and white image. It's probably give you a bit more control. I'm going to cancel out of this one. But there are also, subsequent to this, you can get plugins for things like Nik software and Topaz, and they'll do an even better job on conversions to black and white. But so just once again, image gives you those mode changes. It'll give you adjustments. You can do a number of things here. We won't get into them at this point. One other thing it'll do, just before I do that, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. There's something called canvas size. So if you wanted to put a bit of white space around an image, let's say I want to make another 1/2 inch border around this whole thing in white, I can change this one dimension from 22 to 23 inches, so it'll put 1/2 inch on either side. Change this from 14 to 15. Hopefully I can do that without messing up here. You notice down here it tells you what the color will be of the extension. You can make it white, black, or gray. So I'm going to make it white. Just click OK, and there you go. You created a border around it. I don't know that that's of much use, but generally if I'm trying to do let's say a montage, I might, let's undo that first of all. And I might want to put two pictures side by side, so I might go image, canvas size, and then if I want to push it off to the left, I might do this, and then maybe double the width of this, make it 44. I think it's going to go off the screen here, but anyway, let's live dangerously. And boom, it creates a space here. So now I could, for instance, I could take this guy. Whoop, I'm going to drag him off here so I can see both images. And using this tool up here, we'll get into tools in a minute, but the move tool, that allows you to just drag the image over here. Looks like I've just dragged the top layer, but whatever, you get the idea. So let's go back and delete that first step, and that'll take out the subsequent steps as well. And I'm going to push this guy back up here. So now we've reversed the order of these, but that doesn't matter. So there's the image drop down. And another thing you can do is if you've got let's say you've got a horizon that's not straight. You can do it with image rotation. So yeah, I can do the normal thing of, turning things on its side or whatever. But in this case, I'm going to set that back, and I'm going to choose arbitrary. With arbitrary, I can put the number of degrees I want to actually rotate the thing and which direction I want to rotate it in. Let's say 1/2 degree here. You'll get an idea of what it does. You can see it's rotated the image and left a bit of black border around it. Now you'll want to crop that, of course. So since we're hanging out on this end of the menu bar, why don't we just have a quick look at some of the other selections here. So file, that's where you want to open a new file. New is where you want to create, say, a workspace that's other than what you're seeing here. And Bridge, we'll talk about that at some other point. That's another side program that comes with Photoshop. And I find it handy for being able to go back to the same folder where you get all your source files and not have, things change as you go, as you open files, save them out, and then to a different directory or a different folder, and then you come back and you go to open again and you find you're in a different folder. Bridge will always take you back to the same spot. So moving over to, that's pretty self-explanatory for the most part. That's how you open your files. Edit, I'm going to actually just switch over to this guy for a moment. Edit, and show you something called transform. Now transform it'll be grayed out unless you, or if you only have a flat file like a JPEG that's just comes in as a background. I'll show you. Let's go back to that for a second. If you look in the layers panel, you'll see there's just a background. And if I go edit, transform is grayed out. I can't touch it. So I can either create another layer above this background layer, or let's just quickly, it's probably easier to go over here to this layered file, which we talked about earlier. And maybe I'll click on this airplane layer here. So now I can go into edit. Now that I'm in a layer, I can go into edit, transform, and I can do a number of different things to make this picture look a little funky. And you notice you get this grid if you click on warp, and I can start, well, we're losing the airplane behind some layers here, but I can distort the shape of that object by using this warp function. I've stretched it out there, you can see. So anyway, you get the idea. That's kind of an advanced thing. Since I don't want to destroy my lovely image here, actually I'm just going to go, you have to hit enter once you've done a transform, and it actually completes that. You can see it says warp here. So anyway, that's under edit. That's where you can get at some of these effects to do some really funky things. So that takes care of file and edit, I believe. Typically that's all you need to use. So again, off to the left here is what's called the toolbar. And you remember under window here, we've got tools checked. If I uncheck it, it disappears. If I check it, it comes back again. And let's just quickly run down what's here. And you'll see there's these little flyouts that Photoshop will give you to sort of describe what each of these do. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but this basically, the move tool is the one that you use to move things around. And it's probably the one you're going to land on the most. Another one here is called marquee. And you'll see they've got, each of them has this little arrow kind of in the bottom right hand corner of each icon. And let's say we're going to use a rectangular marquee tool. All that does is, if you start here, let's say if I want to crop this image, I can do this. Now once I let go of my left mouse key, I can't change the shape of this at all. I'll show you another tool that will allow you to do that. But once you've selected that, you can now go under image, crop, and it'll crop it to the size that you have outlined. So another shortcut here, I don't like shortcuts, but Control D will get rid of those, what they call crawling ants or the marquee around it. And I'm just going to go back to open again, and it hasn't deleted those steps in my history yet, but if I start doing something else, they will disappear. So another one you can use is the crop tool, which is right here. This is a bit more versatile. If I kind of outline that same area. Now what it's doing up here is I've got a particular shape picked, and that's 16 by 9, which fits on television formats. And now once I've laid that down, I can move this around and change the size of it, which I couldn't do with the marquee tool. And if that's my selection right there, let's say, I can hit enter and it'll crop it just the same. So the crop tool has a lot more variability to it, a lot more control. You can see that I didn't choose the original ratio here, which would have been the 3:2 format. I had it by default clicked to 16 by 9. So if I went to ratio, I believe, let me try this again. If I change this to ratio, if I'm not mistaken, I can rotate that, certainly. I thought I would be able to, maybe it's width by height. Yes, width by height. I can now change the shape of that. So there you go. You can create your own custom ones like I did with this 16 by 9. I created that. So you can do a new crop preset here, or you can just use the original ratio, which was 3:2 for my original picture, or you can have complete variability by using width by height here. And again, cropping it or hitting enter should, where is this going? There you go. Now it's cropped it to that particular ratio. So that's the crop tool. You've got a lasso tool, which will allow you to, for instance, create a shape. And you might want to do something within that shape, like change the brightness, for instance. So we might go image, adjustments, brightness. Let's just see if that works. Yeah, it's changing at least part of that within that marquee. So that, or within that lasso. So that's just a way of allowing you to do some changes on a specific part of an image. So I'm going to go back to open here again. And this is one of my favorite tools, the quick selection tool. That allows you, as you can see in that example there, to quickly highlight something, in this case a hand. How appropriate, I've got a hand on my picture too. And there's crop, as I said, the crop tool we just used. And then there's other things. I'm not going to get into them at this point. These are refinements like clone stamp. I use that quite a bit. You can use healing brushes as well. You can use eraser to erase parts of an image. So anyway, that's the toolbar. As I say, most cases, we're going to start off by leaving it in the move tool position. Okay, just to finish up, I'm sure some of you are asleep by now, so wake up. We're just going to finish going through this menu bar. I'm going to change images back to this JPEG, which only has the background layer. And just to show you something here, again, layers are kind of advanced, and we're going to talk about that in a separate video. But because again, we're just looking at the navigation around Photoshop for now. So you could create a new layer, for instance, and you could just say layer, and it will just automatically name it. You can rename it. Let's call it mine, because this is my layer. And go OK. You notice it's created one over here called Mine. Another feature is I can go down here and create something called a layer mask. We'll start with Reveal All. You notice it's created another little box over here. And what that does is it allows us to select just parts of a layer. So just to go back here for a second, you'll notice that each of these layers in this layered file has a mask as well. And you can see by that pattern where I've painted out parts of the background and just allowed, for instance, the hand to show through. Or in this case, up here, clouds copy, I did a blotted out parts of the clouds, I guess, so to get the airplane in there. And similarly, around the airplane, painted out everything. That's what's in black, where you're painting out all the background just so that the airplane is there by itself. So that's what layers does. And I'm going to skip over type and select. There's not a lot in there right now that we need to look at, but you might want to have a look at, for instance, filter gallery under filter. What that will give you is a number of different artistic effects that you can apply. So I'm just going to cancel out for a second because I want to go back on this background layer because there's nothing in this layer. I'm going to actually delete this. Right click, delete layer. Yes. Okay, we're back on background. If I went under filter, filter gallery, it comes up with this. So now I'm seeing a pretty large view here. So I'm going to go down to the bottom left and click until I can see the whole thing. This image actually does already have an artistic effect applied, but let's just very quickly show you that you can pick something else and it will start to create a different effect, and you can play with the sliders on the top right here. I'm not seeing a lot of effect with this one, so let's go to, for instance, this effect. Gives you something totally different. You can change brush sizes and so on. So that's looking pretty horrible, I know. I'm just trying to give an example here. That's apart from using things like Nik or Topaz to get those effects, these have kind of been in Photoshop for a long time. So speaking of those two, you'll notice down here I've got Nik collection, and I can choose either the sharpener, I can choose silver effects, which is the black and white conversion. I've also got a couple of Topaz effects, one of which is black and white and simplify. When you buy plugins and you plug them into Photoshop, this is where you find them, is underneath filter. So there's a number of other things in here too that are built into Photoshop that you don't have to buy. You can add blur, you can actually do the opposite, you can sharpen, you can add noise if you try to make it look like an old film or whatever. So again, not spending any time on this stuff. Just to show you that it's here, and that they will probably touch on some of these in a further video. So that is about it. Just one thing I wanted to point out. I was using this bar up here when we were in the crop tool. And again, that's called the options bar. And just have a look down here. We can switch that on or off. And I'll bring it back again just by clicking it. And as you go through these different tools, you'll see that options bar changes. And basically, again, it's giving the options for things like brush size and hardness of the brush for various things, whether it's this eraser tool or whether you're using the actual paintbrush. Kind of will give you the same choices, and each of these is independent. So if you change the brush size under the paint tool, it's going to be different from and independent of the brush size that you might set in the eraser tool, for instance. And you can also add text. I can type some gobbledygook here. Under window, there is a character window. And you can change the font type, you can change the font size, and so on and so on. And now you notice it's created an actual separate layer for text. It will do that every time you click this T icon. It will create a new layer because it assumes you're going to create a different type of text in each case, so that you can separate them and move them around the page, sort of thing. So that's it for navigation. Hope that worked for you. Well, that's it for this segment. I hope it was of some use to you. If it was, definitely please give it a thumbs up, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe. It's one way of encouraging me to continue on with this Photoshop series. I do intend to do more after this this one on navigation, and we'll get more into actual post-processing techniques. So hit the notification bell if you want to be alerted to more of these videos coming online. So until then, thanks for watching.